ahead and start. More people might trickle in, but we can begin. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. The panel we have today is called A Conversation with Afrofuturism Authors. And hopefully a lot of you got the copy of Mothership that we were able to provide for you. If not, no worries. If you just want to learn more about Afrofuturism and speculative fiction, you're still in the right place. First thing we want to share is that this webinar is brought to you by the National Science Policy Network's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee with some support from the Communications Committee as well. This is part of a whole series we have going on in February for a Black History Month celebration in partnership with some other Black-led science-related groups, scientists. It's to really celebrate the accomplishments of Black scientists and Black science-adjacent people in different ways. So for example, Afrofuturistic authors and also scientists throughout history that have been good. And if you look in the chat, Annabelle is showing a link. If you want closed captioning, you can click that and you'll get closed captioning too. And as we said, we were able to provide a lot of copies to people to read some of the stories in Mothership, and we're able to do that all through Black-owned bookstores across the country, depending on where people lived.
I think we're having a Wi-Fi situation.
Potentially. While that's getting set up, I'll talk a little bit more about what Kavi was just mentioning with the supporting Black-owned bookstores. For folks who were able to request a copy of the anthology Mothership, we were able to go across the country and purchase books from there. I think she got kicked off, so she might be a little bit delayed, but I want to go ahead and make sure that we keep this moving forward. So why don't we go ahead and do some quick round of introductions. I know folks who've signed up for the event know a little bit about what you wrote for the Mothership anthology, each one of you, but maybe just like a brief overview about who you are and your work. So I don't know if there's anyone who wants to start.
I'm always ready to start. I was born ready. Anyway, so let me just warm up the room a little bit. So anyway, my name is Linda Addison. I write horror, science fiction, and fantasy. I've won some awards in horror, and I am just finishing my first sci-fi, hard sci-fi novel. So that's me.
You want to tell us what your novel's about, Linda?
Okay. It's I've always been fascinated with quantum physics, and as some people know, I have a BS in math, and I was very interested in physics. I made a career in software development, so it's a lot to do with multiple realities, infinite realities, quantum physics. I had a lot of fun, way far future. A lot of portals opening, a lot of different sizes, a lot of beings coming, which I don't call alien because I can't. You know what? Because I live too close to Mexico. That ain't right. So I call them others with a Z on the end.
I can go next. My name is Andaiye Reeves-Smith. I go by Smith now because I got married last year. Yay for me. Let's see, I'm a librarian, a fairly typical, somewhat geeky kind of nerd person that you think librarians are. I aspire to write as well as these other ladies on the panel. This is actually, the story in this book is my first official published work. So this is really exciting for me. I'm originally from New Jersey, but I currently reside in Georgia. And is there anything else that you wanted us to touch on, you said, Annabelle?
I think the list of questions that I had gotten from Kavi, just in case, we'll probably dig a little bit deeper into.
Okay. So that's me. Glad to be here. Thank you all. A pleasure to meet you all.
Shall I go next?
Go for it.
So my name is Tania D Johnson. I write speculative fiction, of course. I'm also a musician and work as well. My story in Mothership is from a larger series, the Revolution World, Rep World, which deals with genetic reparations for slavery. I like to take the story off the page as much as I possibly can. So musical stories, photography. So it's sort of an installation more project, and very happy to be here with you all today.
I'm Keaney Abura Salaam. I write speculative fiction and lots of other things as well. I have been writing for a while. Linda and I were in the Dark Matter anthology together 20 plus years ago. And we met doing something like this. So it's awesome, always awesome to connect with writers. I find that just having these conversations is great for the brain cells, is great for inspiration, it's great to keep me, you know, connected to everything that we do. But my stories are, I'm the kind of writer, I'm really into fiction. I like every kind of writing and every kind of storytelling. I have lots of people who are only spec fic and that's only what they want to read, that's only what they want to write. But I'm kind of like all over the place. So when that term interfiction came out, I actually got tears in my eyes. I was like, that's me, that's who I am. So I am currently about to have a novel come out in November, which is for children. Middle grade novel about the current moment, about COVID and social justice in November. And I'm working on a YA novel now about a girl with some power. So it's back to the speculative world for the next novel. So that's it. Guess I'll hand it over to Annabelle.
Awesome, thank you. And it looks like Kavi is back. So I just wanted to at least let her get into the swing of things while she's figuring things out. But one thing I think, you know, in what for some folks, speculative fiction is kind of new to them. Could you talk a little bit about the inspiration? Oh no, she went away. Inspirations of diving into speculative fiction and what attracted you to it, and bringing sort of people of color to the forefront of your stories, and sort of the genesis of all of that.
I can start again if you want. Unless somebody else wants to, just, you know. So I actually was on a panel at BosCon with 4 men who are well known in science fiction. And I thought it was a really interesting panel to be on because it reflected what I grew up reading. So I grew up reading speculative science fiction, fantasy, not even by women, mostly by men and obviously white men. So, but my imagination had always been weird. Like my earliest memory of daydreaming was, oh, a cat. What if the cat had wings? I mean, my brain was always wired that way. So it wasn't so much a decision as much as it's just a natural way for me to think imaginatively. Now, naturally for me, even though I grew up without seeing myself in the books that I read, because I've been here a long time. Keaney and I've been around, but I've been around a long time. So I'm not trying to out anybody, but so, but I still wrote it, and I wrote it with myself and other people in it, you know, Chinese, American Indian, because I saw the reality as a worldview in spite of what I was reading. So, like I said, I didn't have a choice, and I really don't see how there's a choice of writing it other than through my own self. You know, even if the character is a white male, it's still going to be through my life of an imagination. So, you know, my work is full of all kinds of peoples.
Yeah, no, okay, well, when I started writing spec fic, it was just out of boredom with writing straight fiction. I was writing straight fiction, and then I was just bored. And I was like, oh, you know, what if this moth, there was a moth on the wall, what if this moth had a message? And, you know, off I went. And then later I looked back at some stories that I'd written as a child, and they were fantastical, like fables and stories. But I actually think that it's less that like what directs people to it, but what takes people out of it. Because as children, that's the normal thing. We're always telling stories and fantastical things, and things fly and talk, and that's a normal part of childhood. And then at some point we grow away from these types of stories. So I think it's always an interesting question, and it's like, why do it? But it's like, why not? That's sort of one of the hallmarks of being human is practicing your imagination. And it's the same way in science, and the same way in writing, and, you know, life. So, and then, yeah, I center myself in everything I do too. Like I just write about Black people because I'm Black, and that's basically it. It's not that deep. I don't know. It's interesting that it appears to be deep to other people, but it's not deep to me to want to represent myself. And I think it says a lot about the world we live in, that is a deep statement, you know.
Hi, I'm back. My internet very randomly went out, but I am here now on my phone. And actually, I think it just worked on my computer too, so I might jump out and jump back again on my laptop, but we'll see. But yeah, if anyone else wants to answer the question Annabelle posed, go ahead.
Well, I can give you my answer. I grew up, fortunately, I say in the 70s, because I think that was a really creative time. We had Star Trek, we had Africa Bambaataa, we had Parliament Funkadelic that my parents listened to. So I had all these different influences, and hip hop was just starting. So all of that creativity was coming together into this culture of dance and music and poetry and all this other stuff. And I think Afrofuturism itself has always been a part of my life. I just didn't know it. We didn't have that terminology at the time. And when I was born, I already had two older brothers in school. My parents were in grad school, so I was surrounded by people who were constantly reading. So that's what I wanted to do. And then I was also, you know, I don't know who else was forced to watch Roots every year. That was a family routine every year. When it came on TV, we had to sit down and watch it. And one of the things that always stuck with me, if you're not familiar with Roots, there's a scene where the daughter of the main character, Kizzy, wants to learn how to read. And if you know about slavery, you know there was a time when African Americans were not allowed to read because reading is what? Power. Words have power. And that stuck with me, and it kind of outraged my little brain that why is she getting in trouble with her parents because she wants to read? I do this every day. I don't understand. And when I would go to school and I would see kids that weren't interested in reading, I would just really get incensed. And I also had the luxury of having two aunts who were librarians, which is slightly unheard of. You don't see a lot of African American librarians. So that was one thing that I strive to become. And I read everything. You mentioned interfiction, Keaney. I read everything. Sci-fi was not my thing, even though it actually was. Again, with reading I would find out this episode of The Twilight Zone was based on this short story, I would go and read it. So I was really reading speculative fiction and science fiction, but there were some things that most of the time I didn't see myself in it. And I think, again, to co-sign with the other two ladies, I write from a Black perspective because that's what I am. I don't know anything else. I think doing that would be a disservice because I don't know. I can ask, but I don't know how accurate it would be to write from a different perspective. So I think that played a lot into just wanting to write and wanting to share a different perspective and put myself into something. And writing is just fun for me. I do that as a side gig. I would love to do it as a professional full-time gig, and I'll get there one day. But for the moment, I write, and again, I was blessed to have this opportunity to have this little short story make such apparently a huge impact with some people. So
I'm gonna get short and sweet. Similar to Linda, I think I just have a what if brain. And I started off as a poet. And for me, poetry became a little too small. My ideas got bigger and they needed more space to breathe and to develop. So I'm not a big fan of separations. So for me, it was really just an opportunity to illustrate the thoughts that were in my head, because I'm pretty theory driven. I was that kid that was reading the encyclopedia and the popular mechanics library with the black and white photos, you know, how this hydraulic machine works. So it was an opportunity to fit different things together and to magnify them to the size where it became unmistakable. Things that were sort of subtle, being one of the only Black kids that was in my classroom, you know, the little microaggressions, this and that. I felt if I could blow them up to a certain size, then people would have to step into those worlds and see things from a different perspective. And also, you know, I write from my perspective, but I try to write from other people's perspectives, but I try to keep the part of us that's the same is sort of the center of all my characters that are not Black characters. And I grew up in a pretty, like I say, one of the only Black people in the classroom, so pretty diverse world. So I wanted to reflect the world I actually lived in.
Cool, thank you all for that. So you all talked about speculative fiction in particular, right? So going into Afrofuturism specifically, and I know you all touched on this a little bit, but how do each of you personally define Afrofuturism as a genre? Anyone can begin if you feel inclined to.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little contested. Just a lot of people have a lot of different theories about it, and the source of it, and whether or not it's inclusive of the African diaspora, or whether it has a bent towards American Blackness. There's a lot of different layers to it, and I don't put a flag down about it. Like, I feel like people need terms, and they're helpful. They're helpful, like the term Afrofuturism was helpful to describe sort of a way of being and a way of relating to creativity. You know, but it's just that. And I think it was Andaiye who was saying when she was younger with the Parliament Funkadelic and the African Bombard, and even before that, Sun Ra. And there's always been this intergalactical connection with different Black artists' creativity. And that's what I think of when I think the term Afrofuturism. You know, I see like P-Funk, like it just in my mind. And so, you know, it's interesting that that term has come so far later as a thing, you know, but it's definitely an element of Black creativity that's been there, you know, probably from the beginning, because if you look at, you know, Dogon cultures where they're very aware of the skyscape, and, you know, it's probably just part of our history. But I personally feel like Afrofuturism is a good description of my crew and like my cultural bent, you know, and I appreciate it for that. But, you know, as for whatever the arguments around the literature, I'm fine staying out of the conversation.
Yeah, I think, again, you know, language is necessary in order to talk, but it doesn't always communicate. So the idea, when I've been asked about it, and I've been writing in it for many years now, I mean, writing speculative for many years in any case, I guess a lot of what I hear is, oh, it's a way for us to write ourselves into the future in some ways, you know, to change what we see the world or have seen it, and to make a future that is different. But I think that has been said, we've always done that. I mean, but the funny thing is that, and we see this now, you know, it's 2021, but I'm pretty feeling like it's going to be 3031 before we can stop worrying about racism and stop worrying about the first Black doing this, that, and the other. And I've been that person. And trust and believe me when I tell you, it's a weird feeling. I'm like, you should be ashamed that I'm the first Black doing this. It's like, you should be ashamed. But it's a reality, sadly. But it's not the reality I write from, but it is a reality that influences my writing without it being direct. A quick story, in Dark Matter, when we were in Dark Matter, I got a call. I had already published in science fiction and been in Science Fiction Writers of America with my writing credits. I got a call from an editor who I've been working with, and he was like, "Oh my God, Linda, I didn't know you were Black." And I was like, "How would you?" Because even though I use different characters, like I said, I use Black, I use white, I use everything. But I thought that was kind of funny. I was like, "Yeah, call me what you want, just buy my book." That's my point of view. I don't care what you call it. Buy my stuff.
Yeah, I think that's totally fair. I liked what both of you said about it's just a word to maybe help other people know like what they want to read, but for y'all, you just write what you want to write and it fits into whatever people put it into. Tenea or Andaiye, do you have any other thoughts about that?
I just agree that, yeah, it's a convenient handle and it's made a lot more people aware of things that apparently they were not aware of. So it's helpful in that regard. And it is fraud and there is, some conflict about the whole thing, but it's useful for as long as it's useful, and then it'll be something else. So.
I'd agree with all of that. As a librarian, what you say about it being convenient to classify the genre is exactly how I feel about it, because I need to know where to put it. What section does it belong in? What Dewey Decimal Number does it need? But I looked it up to prepare for this talk, and it's so wide. And when you ask what it means to me specifically, I think it's like Linda said, writing myself into a place that I supposedly don't belong. I referenced the Twilight Zone again. There was an episode that I recall. I think it was Journey to Mars, and at the end there were a number of Caucasian people boarding this spaceship to Mars. And the first thought I had was, where the Black people at? Y'all can't leave us here. Those kind of things stuck with me. And so when I have an opportunity to write, I don't like to write just things that we typically know. There are so many people that tell you Black people don't do that, Asian people don't do that, Chinese people don't do that, Middle Eastern people don't do that. You don't know what we do. Where no one is a monolith. So when I like to write, I try to include different experiences and things that are typical, supposedly, if that's the correct word.
Yeah, and I think the obsession that Linda brought up with the first is a really interesting obsession, because it's really the first on record. It's the first that you know of. It's the first that you're honoring. It's the first that you're acknowledging. It's the first that you want to talk about. Is it the first? I just watched a really brief thing, which I guess if anybody watches the Super Bowl, you saw Viola Davis spoke about, there was a documentary she voiced about a Black football player who broke the color barrier in the NFL. But we say it as if it was not integrated and then all of a sudden it was, but in the case of the NFL, it started off integrated. And then there was a decision made to exclude Black people. And then they had to break back in. So, we have these stories of slavery, segregation, breakthrough, and it's definitely just not as finite as that. And it's not, as rigid or limited as that, every people, as you were saying, and everybody has like multitudes within them. Every culture has multitudes within them. Every culture probably has a very deep sort of connection to futurism that is interesting to explore, and we just have a richer literature if we bring those stories in and we acknowledge those stories and use them as part of this conversation to help us envision a better humanity.
I think the important thing to piggyback on that is that if you dig into the past, you will see that humans have always had an imaginative way to deal with things, especially difficult things. Some years ago, I wrote a blog on the first Black horror writers. And I didn't know. I started digging. And what I found is I ended up in Zora Neale Hurston's book, Every Tongue's Got to Confess. And she wrote down these stories from slaves And they were like horror stories. They had ghosts, they had witches, they had shapeshifters, they had skinwalkers. And I was like, I'm getting chills now just telling you guys this. I had no idea, but of course they did, because that was the way they could talk about the life they were living without talking about slavery, because that would have been dangerous. So I'm trying to figure out what we would call American Indian futurism. What would that be called?
Yeah, that was one question I had, and one of you mentioned the diaspora in regards to Afrofuturism, but do you think, and I know you talked about this a little, but do you think Black, Indigenous, and people of color in general tend to stray towards speculative fiction because you can kind of talk about the diaspora in a way that's, maybe removed from your actual experiences? Because for me, like, I'm an immigrant from India, and like, I have heard stories about things in India, but I don't feel comfortable writing about it in like a nonfiction sort of way. But in a speculative fiction kind of way, it's more like, this is what I'm predicting for this other place that I'm connected to, but not directly experiencing, if that makes sense.
Well, I'm constantly inspired by other cultures, fables, fantasies, gods, goddesses, original stories. I don't think you have to be, from that. I wrote a vampire story in Dark Thirst that is the main vampires from Africa. The hunter was Chinese, and there was an American Indian Navajo. I mean, I felt comfortable writing it because the point of it is to write a story, to tell a tale that is interesting. And I was very inspired to do it with those different characters. So I learned enough so that I didn't sound like an idiot when I was writing about the culture. But I'm not doing an anthropology paper about China. I'm not doing an anthropology paper about Navajos. I just did enough to be respectful of the way I was writing the characters, but every human has the same thing. So every culture is filled with incredible fables, which I find very inspiring. And I don't think it should be a matter of not doing it. You shouldn't do it if you're going to be lazy about it. You can't spend some time doing a little research so you can be respectful. Then yeah, don't do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we've all seen examples of it done incorrectly. And hopefully that's becoming less as it's called out more, but definitely common. I guess another related question is, who do you think Afrofuturism is for? Like, it's definitely for everyone to read and consume. I would think you would agree with that, but if not, let me know. But do you think it's like to educate people about past the history? Because I know some of your works is based on history, or is it to serve as a warning sometimes? Because some of you write about climate change in a science fiction sort of way. Or is it genuinely just to read and consume as fantasy or science fiction or horror, whatever?
I wasn't aware of it, but someone told me recently that, or not that recently, last year, my stories are, people go through things in my stories. You don't get over things, you get through them, right? And the way that he put it to me is that I built hope in a little bit at a time. So I feel as if I do have that intention in my work. I do want to change what's possible by changing what people believe is possible in some stories, but I also write things that are purely for enjoyment because I feel like we need that as well. Our spirits need to be fed in different ways. So, but I do that, but I'm also cautious of saying that it's necessarily pedantic work because I also wouldn't want to feel as an author that I had to educate people about certain things as a Black person, frankly. I don't want to be put into that role of, explain it to me. Just, maybe put some work in and figure some things out for yourself and come to the story with something. And then we'll meet in the middle. Because I feel as if fiction it's very, it's something that requires two different people. It's interactive. I can write instructions, but it happens in your mind. It's like I can write a recipe down, but you have to cook it.
Yeah, I love that. I get a lot of criticism for some of my stories because I like to start just right in the middle, just plop you down, and people don't get oriented and they say a lot. I don't know. I didn't know what was happening until page 2, till page 3, till page 4. And I've gotten reviewers saying, oh, I like it better when she sticks closer to reality because it's too far away. So as you're saying, Tenea, did I say it right?
Yes.
I just trained myself because I want to say Tenea. Tenea, as Tenea says, it's a partnership. And, you know, as a writer, the things that are exciting to me are probably more challenging to my audience to read, and even to me to read. Like when I go back and read one of my earlier stories where I was experimenting with language, I was like, who put in the time to read this? At this age, I don't want to put in the time to read this, but I loved writing it. And I guess I loved reading it at the time. I don't know. But I feel like there's no one purpose for Afrofuturism. There's no one purpose for a human being. Like what I love about literature is that we all have our unique voices. What I love about people is that we all have our unique voices and expressions. You meet somebody, they're funny. You meet somebody, they're, you know, incisive. You meet somebody, they're, you know, a warrior, they're whatever. We have all these little stamps, you know, in ourselves. And I love to see that in authors' voices, like in authors' stories. Some people just want to write absurd shit. That's what they want to do. And they want to do it. And they're Black and they like to write about Afrofuturism. That's great. Some people want to write about history. I just learned about this romance writer who I wish I knew her name right now, but she's written like 19 books about 19th century Black people who were not enslaved. So they had all kinds of lives. They were on the frontier. They were post people. They were printers. They were freedmen, whatever. And these romances that she deeply and profoundly researches. And you could think that she's a romance writer and just sort of chuck that to the side. She's actually spending a lot of time animating this part of history that we flattened into a one-dimensional perspective of what Black people were at that time. And I'm so inspired by that. It's like, it doesn't really matter what lane you're in or what kind of writing you do, what your genre is. You can express whatever it is that you want, you know? And ultimately, I feel like that's what speculative fiction is about. It's about like freedom of imagination, freedom of consideration, freedom. Oh, we're living like this, but we could be living like that, you know? And, you know, Afrofuturism just does that, you know, from a Black perspective and with, you know, Black culture in mind.
I think like most artists as well, when you write or you do a painting or you create a poem or a form of dance, it's what you're in at the moment. I don't think, you know, some people you kind of feel like everything that a Black person does has a political reason, and it's not always that. Sometimes it's, you know, just like you said, it's to entertain, but it could be whatever you're going through in that moment. The piece that I wrote dealt with some things that I was going through at the moment. Why are we still having these same issues with colorism and racism? And why are we still fighting the drug war? And why, you know, all these other things that just happen to be bothering me at that time. But I have another story about an adult male with autism that happens to be Black, because that's another part of the world that I know, because I have a son with autism. I might write another story about a young African-American girl because I have a daughter. I could write a story about a dog and a cat. I've written children's novels, books, they haven't been published, but I have them just because whatever I was feeling at that time, that's what I wrote about.
Yeah, a lot of my writing comes from my reacting to things. And so I've always said I'm an organic writer, but that doesn't mean my writing doesn't have theme and purpose. It just means I'm not making that decision. And I do a lot of poetry. Unless someone has an anthology and they want a poem about unicorns, then I'll write a poem about unicorns. But you know what? It's going to be a unicorn that's gone through some stuff. You know what I'm saying, Tenea? I mean, you know what I'm saying, right? I mean, because life is that. Humans are that. Even these unrealized humans out here who are still having a problem with the diverse planet that they're on. See how I said that? That was
very kind of you. Very generous.
I'm trying, always trying. Not always when I'm not being recorded, it wouldn't have come out like that. But anyway, and also I find myself going back, like I haven't done novels and this is my first excursion and I have a few I want to try. And what I did with this one, even though it's like based on some hard science, I made a list of different areas of the earth with humans that I wanted to see how they would react to this influx of life from other dimensions. So I made a list, like I want to talk about what it's like in prison. I want to talk about working class. I want to talk about people, all these different things, because you know what? We're all human, but we do have different reactions depending on the situation. And that was, so I would call this, even though it would be considered hard sci-fi, I would call it very human hard sci-fi, because I'm always curious, like others here, about human beings. I'm just completely, like if I walk in a room, I'm walking in like, I want to meet you. You got a problem with me with my skin color? Okay, I really don't need to meet you. You can leave. Not my job to try to fix you. I want to talk to people who are willing to talk to me, so.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like what you all said about how when Black authors or people of color in general maybe write or do any sort of creative expression, it's instantly politicized. And it's like, what are they trying to say about the Black experience? When really it's just, maybe you're inspired by the Black experience because you're obviously Black, but that doesn't mean you're trying to say something. And I feel like white authors don't need to deal with that, specifically white men. Like they can just put art out and it's just whatever it is. And when they want to make a statement, people will allow that. But yeah, if you are Black or a person of color, it's very much just like, what are they trying to say about the experience? Like, how does slavery tie into this? Because like, that's what people want you to be talking about all the time, or like, whatever.
I mean, they have the privilege of being every man, but you're a Black woman. You are a person of color. You know, they put you in that box, and that's what you have. That's the value that you have to them, as far as they know in that time, if they are, as you say, unrealized human being. And that's not everybody, but it's the ones that would do that, that would label you and put you in that box and discard you in that pile over there. I'm not reading Black people today, you know?
Yeah.
And that's what I like about the term Afrofuturism, just not so much how it's used, but just in my mind, what it does for me is I just think of a world, you know, and I think of a world where Black people are just being funky, they're being themselves, it's just about being Black, and that's it. You know what I mean? And creative, you know, and that's it. And maybe somebody's watching, maybe they're not. Maybe we're talking history, maybe we're not. Maybe we, you know, but it's always gonna be interesting. It's always gonna be creative and colorful and, you know, something with a little bit of swing and energy and interest, you know?
And that's the thing about writing, because I've edited a lot of things. I'm the editor for Space and Time magazine, the poetry editor, and have been for 10 or more years. And other situations and panels I've been on talking about editorial and changing, publishing, blah, 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 blah. The whole thing is like, why would you want to discourage different voices to read? Personally, I think that's more interesting. I like to read. I have, like I said, Chinese fables, African fables, Indian fables, American Indian, because I think it's interesting. You know, a book that just came out called Slay, I think it was edited by Nicole Kurtzman, if I'm not mistaken. And it's Black people writing vampire stories, and everybody's like, vampire stories are over. I read this book. You know what? Different, interesting, different way of talking about vampires. So why not? Why not?
Yeah. Shifting a little bit, because we have a few questions in the chat, but before that, I want to get into some of the science in your stories. So a lot of the attendees here today are part of the Science Policy Network and are early career researchers or PhD students or whatever. And since you all write some sort of science fiction or talk about things in science, do you ever like have to do the research on the science and like, yeah, I'm seeing nods. What is that process like? Like, do you look at publications? Do you look at news stories? I'm really curious because we obviously as scientists are looking at publications all the time, but that's unfortunately not accessible to the general public. So yeah, thoughts on how you get science to be legitimate in your stories?
I think you have to become a little mini expert. Like I've got my JSTOR account, which I abuse every time I can, because I am looking for the latest science for something. Sometimes I need a basic understanding, and sometimes I need to really go far into the weeds to make sure, because I do like a certain amount of plausibility depending on what I'm writing. If I'm writing something that's magical, that's one thing. But if I'm writing something that's about genetics, if I'm writing something about quantum physics, then I need to know what I'm talking about. And I need to know what the latest theories are to see if what I'm positing is even within the realm of possibility if one thing changed. I kind of want to find that one thing. So I know, even if I never put it in the story, I know.
Cool.
I'm like so loving researching science that I literally have to stop myself and remember that I'm writing because, because it just gets me so excited. This book I'm working on, as an example, each chapter is influenced by some real thing that I read. So at the end of each chapter, I have like a 2-sentence thing talking about, you know, some article about, you know, this, that, and the other that involves genetics, quantum physics, whatever. And then I just I'm like an official daydreamer, put that on my card, daydreamer. Like I just extrapolate from there into just, you know, go like a weed in craziness. So I do like to start with real science. So where do I go? I'm really, now I go on the internet. I used to live in the library, physical library, but now I go on the internet, and there are some science papers that are available, and I don't need enough depth that I need to go to like the very, very, very latest. But a lot of the places that I get, I wasn't ready for this, or I would have given some specifics, but there are some very, you know, scientific written papers about some things, and I use it just to pick up concept, language, and then I'll change the language. I'll create my own language, but I like to base it on what is actually out there. So I find it very invigorating and exciting to read science to a fault.
Exactly.
Well, I think that makes sense with your background in math. You're
and
already
I'm comfortable
interested
reading it, right? I'm comfortable
Yeah.
reading through these things. I'm like, yeah, whatever.
Do you all find that finding things related to science is accessible? Andea, I know like you work at a library. Do you ever go to the like science nonfiction shelf and pull something?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. I use a lot of JSTOR as well.
Mhm.
A lot of the databases that our library subscribes to, even for as short as my story is, I think it might be a page. It might be an 8.5, 11 by 11 page. But even in that story, I was just looking at that page and I'm like, yeah, I had to research that. Just, can you inject some sort of microchip? What does AI look like? What is Elon Musk doing? He's doing whatever he wants. What terminology, things like that. I also looked at climate change, energy use. What would GameStop look like? Ironically, in 2032, would it still be here? Would we need those resources? You know, it goes back to all the components that I research. What goes into a cartridge? Who's mining these little pieces of whatever components have to go into this cartridge, and what does that look like? All these things are some of the stuff that I thought about in research in writing that story, because it's speculative, it's fiction, but you don't want to sound like you're 5 years old and you're just making stuff up. You just threw it on the page because it's my imagination and it's just here. So it had to have some sort of logic to it.
I don't write a lot of science fiction. I'm the outlier here in terms of that, and I don't do a lot of science research. I do read about sort of things that are interested in me, and in my day job, I create educational materials for kids. So we have a big program with the science division, and we talk a lot about science research and what scientists are discovering. So I am an interested party in a lot of things, and I do a lot of reading, but I think I'm more of a have things filter. And then as I'm writing, I might leave a little bracket like, oh, you need to figure this out. You need to figure that out. And when I go back and edit, I'll do as much research as I need to just get that little detail in there and then keep it moving. And I have a story that's very science focused that hasn't worked out yet. And that's probably because I need to do some more research. So the things you see published made it through without too much research. And the things that are on my hard drive need more research. But I love it. I love the fact that, you know, we think about science. I don't know how people think about science, but it's kind of considered over here, or over there, and not sort of central. But everything that's we touch is related to science. There's no part of life when we wake up in the morning till we go to bed is related to science and some kind of science research, science innovation, you know. And it's connected to imagining the possibilities. Well, what if this? This is what's happening, but what if that? And what if this? And if I research this, what would I find out? And how could this influence life, you know? It's a very similar, I think, thought process in terms of thinking through possibility. Different application.
And talking about children in education, which I'm just like, everybody who's doing that, librarians, the library was like my heaven growing up, because I grew up in a tough household in a tough neighborhood. So the library, and all I did was read everything I could get my hands on. And I love the concept. And my first time of even being able to be involved in this is I had a poem called The Cosmic Adventures of Jar Boy, which is now going to be included in a book that's being designed for students, because in that poem, almost every section that mentions anything about Earth, outer space, and anything else is based on real science. And so the editor was like, yeah, we could write a whole study guide to this poem, because there's all these references that you're making. And that wasn't accidental, that was on purpose. So, you know, I write from a human point of view, but I do like to use, you know, real stuff when I can. My story in Mothership is not that scientific.
So yeah, I love that you all do research for whatever, like whether it's about the cultures that you're including, whether it's about the science. I think that's really important for fiction writing, even though people might not realize that. They might just be like, oh, you're writing a story, you just do it. But I appreciate when people do the background research. It makes it it makes you feel like you're in the world a little more. But kind of flipping that, we have a question about, for many of us where writing is more technical in nature, what advice would you give to folks who want to dip into their more creative side?
I have a very favorite strategy. Don't pick up that language. Number one, that's my first tip. Don't say very favorite. But I have a strategy that I love using called free writing, which basically what you do is you set your timer for a specific amount of time. And if it's your first time doing it, maybe set your timer for like 3 to 5 minutes. And you just randomly pick something. You pick a theme, you pick a character, you pick, you know, a piece of art, an object that you see. And then you start the timer and you write. And you just write what comes to your mind. If you don't have anything that comes to mind, you just go, I don't know what to write. I don't know what to write. Your subconscious will kick in and you will start to imagine things. I still do free writing, and I like that it kind of takes you to another part, unintentional place in your mind. And it's a good way to kind of let down some of the barriers that stop you from accessing your creativity. So I would recommend some free writing, see where that takes you, see where you end up going, and that might tell you something about what you might be interested in as a creative writer.
So perfect. This is exactly, I mean, this is why you and I are besties almost, kind of. I call it wild writing, you know, wild seed writing, where you just sit down and you just go and you just keep the pencil or fingers moving for a period of time, a piece of paper, and whatever comes, you just keep going, you keep going. And if you have an idea, and I teach a workshop that is teaching poetry for non-poets, and some of the best poetry I've seen has come from me. So because people are not used to letting their imagination go. So even if you're right, even if your major is something like biochemistry, take something from that and do wild writing or pre-writing. I like that. Pre-writing for like a minute or two or whatever, and just let it go. Your subconscious will give you some really interesting stuff. Trust and believe.
Something will come out. I think the other thing that I've noticed, and the person didn't ask about like writing as a career, But one of the things that separates me as a writer or other writers from non-writers is not so much that we're talented and they're not. I have friends who have amazing voices, amazing stories. I'll read something that they wrote, wonderful. I'll say, this is great. You know, why don't you do this, this, this in the next draft? And they're like, next draft? You know, not doing another draft. So that's the other thing too. The writing doesn't come out perfect. You know, you do that while writing, you put it down, you have an idea. You're going to have to craft it, and you're going to have to spend time on craft, and it's time worth spent. I know a lot of people who think, oh, it doesn't sound good, I must not be a writer. I don't know how to do this, I must not be a writer. Give yourself space. If it means something to you, you don't have to, but if it means something to you, give yourself the space and time to develop the skills, to develop your voice, to see where you're going. It's something that builds on itself, just like studying science or studying a career, and as a researcher, learning more and more about your topic. You know, give yourself time to develop. You could be writing one way 1 year, and if you keep at it, you'll see your development, you know, over time. So that's the second piece.
Cool. That's really helpful to hear. For me too, I really enjoy creative writing. I always have, but it's always just been for me, which is fine. But now I'm kind of like, maybe I could like put it somewhere for people to read, but that's terrifying, which goes into our next question, which is, what advice do you have to those who are thinking about creating something in a similar sense, i.e. creating something new and putting out into the world? How do you deal with the anxiety of being vulnerable and putting yourself out there?
Do it anyway. Do it anyway. Everyone's scared of something. The trick is to not let that stop you. That's all.
Yeah, I mentor people, and what you just said is the absolute approach when I talk to them about, when they're like, you know, I always also say, go to the top market and work your way down, because you know what, you can get rejected from the top market just as fast as the bottom. So you might as well start at the top. You might be surprised. And when they're like, you know, yeah, but what if I get rejected? I said, what if you do? You think you're gonna die? You're not gonna die. You can be afraid and put your submission through. I am not your therapist. I'm not trying to understand people's fear. I'm just saying what you feel and what you do can be different, just like what you just said. That's right.
I also think that building a community is great. Early on in my writing career, probably the first 5-10 years of writing, I was always in a writing group. And the reason why that was helpful for multiple reasons. One, even one of the groups that I was in, we had to read our submissions to each other. That was helpful because, you know, when I had to read my work, I was like this. I was on the radio and they didn't tell me I sounded like that. They let me be on the radio like that, get recorded. It wasn't live. They could have stopped me. I'm on the radio, you know. But it takes years to get to that point where you're comfortable having conversations with people. You're comfortable reading your work. You will slow down and spend time with it. That's vulnerable to even, like, you know, have to present your work. So having a community of people who are, you know, at all different levels, they don't have to be at the same level as you, in which you're coming together. Someone else is committed to this goal. Someone else is being vulnerable. You're sharing with each other. You're giving each other feedback and critique circles on your work. You're hearing other people say, oh, I sent this out. Oh, I got a rejection and I'm still going, you know. Seeing that thing is not unique to you. You're not the only person getting rejected. We're all getting rejected all the time, you know. I've been invited to participate in things and then get rejected. I told y'all, people like love my work and hate my work at the same time. It's weird. So it's not, you know, it's not going to hurt you, but also finding a community where you can sort of build and start developing in a place where you can hold somebody's hand and be like, oh my God, you know, this is really challenging, but we're going to keep going, you know.
And the trick I always do with it, because I'm just stubborn, so literally I sent stuff to Isaac Asimov's science fiction magazine for over 10 years before I got accepted. I am sure they got tired of seeing it. I didn't care. So what I always tell people that I work with is have at least 3 places you're going to send it to. So you're not sitting, if it comes back, you're not sitting there mulling over it. If you can make it better, but keep that biatch on the street, man. Keep it out there.
I would say, I would agree. I would agree with, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I would agree with all of that. And just from the librarian perspective, there are tons of books in the library. Not all of them get read, but guess what? We pay for it. So if it circulates one time, it circulates one time, and it may have made a world of difference to that one person. I have a ton of stories that I've written and I've shared with people who have, shared with me that, it's done something for them. It's made them feel one way or the other. Never been published, probably never will be, but I've got stories. To go back to that original question you asked, I like to, before cell phones, I would travel with a notebook. And if someone, I think we're all like this, someone might say something interesting, and you're like, oh, I wonder when they go home, what's going to happen with that? Or if you ride the train or you ride the bus or you're at you're out in public and you hear something interesting, you see someone with a great outfit, you wonder where they got those shoes, you can make up a story about that. I wish I knew the author. Someone actually published a great book on conversations heard on the train. There's no stories. It's just weird 1 or 2 liners about something they heard on the train, and it just stuck with them, and they wrote an entire book about it. So it can be done. And like everyone else is here saying, just write.
Yeah.
Just write. You never know what's going to attract one person to your book, and it might make a world of difference to that one person.
Yeah, I think you have to be more committed to doing it than to nurturing whatever this anxiety or fear or, is. You have to be more committed to just doing it than that. In my first job, I worked at a Book of the Month Club. So, we had all our books reviewed, and then we'd have quotes in the catalogs, and we'd get a reviewer back saying, this book sucks. Their first book was good, but this is wrong with it. This is wrong with it. And you know what the quote said? Top of their game, a glowing example of the genre. That's what the review came out after. I saw the truth that, so please know that what you're measuring yourself against isn't always amazing. The best writer may not necessarily be the best seller. The bestseller may not be the best writer. That's a good thing, because if you think you're not that good, but maybe you could tell a really good story, you could be a bestseller. You could make more money than me, So it's just, I feel like that's the other thing about human beings and uniqueness, that we all have a different voice. We all have a different story to tell. And readers are not monoliths either. Sometimes a reader wants to read something deep. Sometimes they want to read something fun. Sometimes, you know what I mean? Like, it's just diversity. So bringing your own diverse person to the fore is always worth it, I think. It's always.
If I can say just one more thing. Go ahead.
No, you go.
The more often you allow yourself to be vulnerable, the more you'll realize you're a badass. Whether or not you choose to tell other people, you can be a humble badass. But it's really just becoming more of yourself. If you want to do it, and you do it, you'll have more respect for yourself.
You are just in my head. I was just about to say that the most important thing that I teach to younger writers, and I don't mean age, but I mean in writing and committing to writing, is that the more authentic you can be, the closer you can be to your shadow and your heart, the more the world needs that voice, and the more that's going to touch somebody. Not to be like someone else, not to write like me, but to write like you. That is so important. And if you touch one person, job done. So just like you said, that authenticity is everything.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it sounds like you got to shoot your shot, and
Just shot.
Yeah, and if you do it once, it probably gets easier with time. It's like ice skating. If you fall, you realize it's not that bad anyway.
Yeah.
Do you ever, okay. Many of you move between different styles of writing. Some of you write prose and then poetry. I think, Keaney, you also do art, right? How do you travel between these different forms of writing and art? And how do you decide which ideas fit what style? Is it you get the idea and you decide you want to do it in that style, or do you pick a style and then come up with the idea?
I think that it's a conversation going back and forth between the idea and its expression, because it'll tell you, if you like with visual art, if I'm trying to do something in a collage format and it's not working, I might need to switch to painting, or it's a conversation. And I think the longer you write, the more comfortable you are listening to what the experience is telling you. My dad has said to me, my dad's a writer, and my dad has said to me, I'm a better editor than a writer. I repeat that all the time. Yeah, my dad's real. But it's true that I really like to just throw things down and be like, well, what do I have here? You know, what do I have here? I have a story that I wrote that it wasn't working very well, but I had this idea of this woman who was a character who was a bathroom attendant in a New York club, a flashy New York club, and she's like a roots woman. So even though people are out trying to have a good time, if you cross her path, she's gonna give you the realness, and you might have a breakdown in the bathroom. And this woman was passing and came into the bathroom and had a whole moment, but it wasn't a story, you know, it was an idea. And so I went ahead and told the backstory of the bathroom attendant, and that turned into the whole story. That was the whole story that, you know, was a complete thing. And I just listened, I said, okay, you know, and then years later, I took the story of the woman who was passing, I told that story. The story I wanted to tell never really came out, and I could have spent time just, you know, pushing it. But instead I said, okay, it doesn't mean something's wrong with me. It doesn't mean, you know, I'm a bad writer, that I can't tell the story right now. There's a story over here, I'm gonna tell it, you know. Here's the story, I'm gonna tell it. So being willing to follow and listen and flow is really how I end up deciding where an idea is going to go. And as I said, I have novels on my desktop that haven't come through yet. They're there, they're written, but they haven't, you know, put themselves together yet. And I have to be patient through that process and, you know, be willing to kind of go. I had another teacher, he said, follow the heat, you know, follow the heat. If you're willing to do that, you know, you can have, I think, a more vibrant sort of artistic product, you know, instead of insisting on deciding the format before, you know, you dig in.
I love the language that you use. You know that. I always tell you that. Conversation with it. Okay. So for me, it often does come through as poetry. I've said that's my first voice. And then I've taken poems and created stories from them. I've taken stories and created poems. Sold both, by the way, because you know who likes to see her name in print? This one. So
like in the street.
Woo. And a quick story. I have been trying to get into Asimov's science fiction magazine forever, like from the first issue on, and it was years. And I went to a street fair in New York. New York is book country, and I had a conversation with Frederick Poole. And I was like, I'm trying to get into Asimov's and blah, 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 blah. And he was like, well, you know, every science fiction writer has to write a Why the Dinosaurs Died story. And I was like, really? So, okay. I go home and I write a Why the Dinosaurs Died story. It was like 50 words. So, and I was in a writer's group, which is indispensable. I've been in the same group since 1990. And I turned this 50-word story into the group, and everyone's like, Linda, this is not a story. This is a poem. I was like, oh, okay. So then I rewrite it as a poem.
She gets turned down and she's like, oh, okay, good idea.
I'm always trying to pay attention. You know what I'm saying? I'm not assuming I know everything. I'm always like, oh, this, okay. And so I send that in after 13 years. That was my first acceptance at Isaac Asimov's science fiction magazine. I got in every year after that for a few, and then I was like, I think I'm gonna go over here and see if I can beat down the New Yorker's door, but you know. So that's just that's just like a little story to say, you know. For me, I do the same thing, the forum, but I love this conversation. Yeah, I have a conversation with the inspiration and then see how it goes.
Yeah, I love that wording too. It speaks to how it's a living work and not just stagnant. Any other thoughts on that?
I think that usually things come out organically as one thing or another to me, but more and more I'm trying to put them all in the same piece. Like I'm working on a fiction album now. I like things that are media, I guess. We'll go with that. Interfiction to a certain extent. But yeah, like it comes out as whatever it is. And sometimes they know how to play together. So then they become a new form, and then everyone goes, what is that? I try to explain it. And it's just better if they read it or they hear it. It's hard to explain.
I've always admired artists who are artists that can do the visual and the written and the physical and turn it into these masterpieces. I am not able to do that myself, but I know people that can. So when we talk about families and networks and mentors and groups, sometimes you might have the vision to turn it into something like that. Maybe not skill set, but you can still, make it whatever you need to make it. I also believe that things happen organically. Sometimes I've written a poem and it ends up being more children's book format. Sometimes it's vice versa. But one of the things that I enjoy is when it becomes that experience. I kind of got familiar with Afrofuturism through Onyx Con, which is a African-American comic book convention, but they also deal with speculative fiction and just all kinds of things. And there's art and there's music and there's dance and there's cosplay, but you can see from just things like that where these artists connect with one another and, oh, you have a book, I can paint, I really like this part, let me paint a portrait about this. And then some, oh, that makes me feel this musical piece, let me put this together. And then the next thing you know, you have this whole experience from this one story.
That's really cool. I like that idea of different people who work in different mediums being inspired by people's work. I think that's a really beautiful process. Another question about your writing, how do you decide what year or time period you're going to set your story? I noticed for a couple of your stories in Mothership, specifically Keaney's and Tenea's, yours seem to be uncomfortably close to current day times. Of course, when you wrote it, it was farther away, but is that intentional when it is close to current day times and it is like a kind of apocalyptic scenario pretty much? Or do you really think that stuff is going to happen that soon and you're predicting it? And Linda and Andaiye, you can answer that as well.
I think for my story, sorry,
No, go ahead.
Okay, for my story, it wasn't intentional because I think the probability is always there.
I think, there's different genres, there's far future, near future, and it really depends on the idea, where it's located. And I think especially dystopias, when you think about dystopias, you have a sense of like how fast you think something's going downhill, basically. Yeah. Is it a near future? Is this a far future? And I think one thing that near future dystopias do is that they really get under your skin because it's familiar enough that you see that leap, It's not like, oh, this person made this ideological leap and now we're in a world with blue, trees. And you're like, oh, I wonder what that's like. And, maybe you could get immersed in that world and it becomes real. But the near future stories, it's like, oh, when I open my door, I see this, and this, and we're just one small leap, away from whatever this horrible reality is, So yeah, I do think when you're talking about environmental issues especially, but speaking of near future, everybody I hope knows about Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler, who is a very fierce writer who does not let you go, as Tenea was saying with her work, that you're gonna go through something. She puts her characters through it, but talking about a near future story that's super predictive of like where we are, I think that it's just it's a powerful tool to talk about social realities. So yeah.
And now that you mentioned that, I can hook in and say that I was doing some research because Octavia Butler is like almost my religion. I just love her work so much. And when I started reading her, I didn't even know she was Black. I just fell in love with the writing, the characters, the story. And I just wrote a piece that's coming out later this year about her. And so what I did is I went to an interview that they did with her talking about her writing. It was one, I can't remember, but I have in my notes. because I wanted to know what she thought about it, because a lot of people had been asking her, are you predicting the future?
Mhm.
And what she basically said in that interview is, I don't want this to happen. I am not trying to be a prophet and produce. She didn't use that word. I'm paraphrasing and being dramatic, as I am ought to do sometimes. I'm not trying to predict this. This is what humans can do. So in this unraveling an incredible way that she is now, yeah, the last few years have been pretty close to what she's written. But again, in her own words, that was not what she wanted to see. That was a possibility.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think Keaney's story, Bioanger, because it is about climate change and coastal flooding and all of that, since that's broadly the space I work in, I was like, yeah, this could totally happen in the next 20 years if people don't get it, if scientists and politicians, whatever, get it under control. Like, we could totally see people living underground and like this whole dangerous situation where like humanity is gonna dissolve. And then Tenea, yours about reparations really being taken, not necessarily even to the extreme, but just kind of reaching a breaking point where it's like, we're not getting what needs to be done. So it's taken to a revolutionary point, which I think is very related to the culmination of the Black Lives Matter movement, which of course has been going on for a long time, but it's gained more social traction recently.
And different people take different approaches, and you're not going to like some of those approaches. So.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, they're all necessary. All the approaches are necessary. That's what I always say. My story is not, mine just came to me in a flash like a poem, so it's very short. It's one page. I'm sorry about the voice thing disappearing, but I just had, and the neighborhood it happened in is one of the neighborhoods I grew up in. That voice in it is like very much back from, the neighborhood, and just like this flash of something just, and this, and this, and by the way, spaceship on the roof. So I always liked how that kind of just happened in this little short piece, but I wasn't trying to predict anything in a sense. I was trying, my story, and I can explain things after I write them since I write organically. I didn't think about this when I wrote it, but I was really just trying to put in a little ding about how we think we know things about things, but we can be wrong. Which is, the conversation I find interesting when I've been on panels with scientists talking about we're the intelligent life in all of the infinite universe. And I'm like, oh, really? You believe that? Okay. Okay, dokie.
Yeah, I like the really creepy ending to your story. It gave me chills, and I was like, oh God. I'm like afraid of aliens for some reason, so that really hit me.
And my job is done. My work is finished.
Yeah. And Andaiye, yours was, I think, also really realistic, and you also had an environmental aspect to it, which was injections instead of using, plastics or whatever to consume things. Which also creeped me out because I feel like with things like VR happening, which is crazy to me still, injections could be the next thing. And I think it's cool that you envisioned that.
And I thought to bring it a little closer, but I pushed it out a little bit, but I almost feel like we're almost there. It's to a point, I personally feel like it's almost legal for people of color to become, I don't know how to put it, to be able to get high, or however you want to call it. Don't look at what's going on over here. Distract yourself with whatever. And whatever you're going to distract yourself with is not really going to be beneficial to you in the long term. But, when we see with the legalization of certain things, we don't have cigarettes now because they're dangerous, but you can vape all you want. Unless now it's a problem at school, so now we gotta revamp that. So I just kind of looked at how things seem to be progressing and took it a little bit further out there. And, as far as with the injecting and things, again, that goes in with the research. Can something like that actually be done? Where is AI going? But now if we can put artificial intelligence into our clothing, and we're doing things with fetal pigs, and I don't know what else is happening behind closed doors. How far are we really from this type of thing? And then even with calling people infected as opposed to calling them slurs. Okay, well, we'll be politically correct and we'll call you yellow and brown, and but you still can't do what I can do.
Yeah, I think it's cool that each of your stories really approached the time period and like how realistic things are in different ways. I think that really shows the diversity of Afrofuturism as a genre. A question from the audience. What advice would you give to aspiring writers with regards to writing authentic and diverse characters of different races, genders, sexualities, ethnicities, etc.? Is this inappropriate or impossible? If possible, what should writers always remember or never do?
Never.
I want to say, I'm sorry.
No, please.
I made a comment earlier that writing from the perspective of someone from a different culture would be a disservice. And what I meant is for me, because I don't have that skill set yet. I know that there are people that are able to do it and do it quite well. So I think it can be done. I think Linda alluded to earlier, you do your research, you need to immerse yourself in the culture and know the people and consult. Just don't go out there and just say, hey, all of them do this, I'm gonna write that down. It has to have some level, and what we've been saying all along, some level of authenticity. But you also have to know when you don't have that skill set. And that's, again, where writers groups and things come into play.
Yeah, and it's good to have someone read. I mean, when I did the vampire story, which by the way, I've already got like a novel in the back of my head on that one. For the Chinese American vampire hunter, I had a Chinese friend look at it. Because again, I wasn't writing an anthropology story, but in the story, it refers to his parents coming here from China and some basic thing about a wedding. And I wanted it to at least be respectful and not just be a cliche. And I wanted to mention this book. Okay, writing the other folk, take a screenshot. Don't
and
forget.
they have workshops. They conduct workshops for writing the other. They've added different like subgenres.
Right, by Nancy Shaw and Cynthia Ward. The book is called Writing the Other, and look it up. You can also take workshops. Because again, you don't have to spend years studying a culture to write about it, but you do need to break out of a cliched version of the world that you're looking at that's not you, and be able to do it with some respect. So I highly suggest this book and their workshop to help out with that. And as a short story real quick, I wrote a story where I decided, because I'm curious about different people too, like others have said, I wanted to know what if this main character was in a wheelchair their whole life. So I decided to make the character in a wheelchair. They didn't have to be. I got online and I watched videos on how to be in a wheelchair and move for the first time. I sat in my writing chair with wheels. I got the language. I read blogs on people who are in wheelchairs to see the perspective of how the society is looking at them. And the only thing I didn't get a chance to do because of the deadline was have someone in a wheelchair review it for me. But I was super, super careful with the language and this concept that if you're in a wheelchair, of course you don't want to be in a wheelchair. And it's not necessarily the factual truth. A lot of people accept where they are, but the way we see them is different. So that's another way to be sure your story is not a cliche.
Yeah, that connects to what I was going to say, which is I think you need to know why you're writing about someone from another culture and be aware of your own biases. So make sure you're not putting someone in there that you don't mind doing violence to, and that's why they're another culture. Don't put somebody in there because you need a dumb character, and that's why they're of another culture. Be aware of why it is that you have this person as another culture, of another culture. And if you can't relate to that person as that character is another human being, that is a hint that you may not be able to do it properly. I have in my book, I actually, Kavi said earlier, do we feel more comfortable writing speculative because it's, you know, sort of like, you know, it's not, you were talking about connecting back to India, not having lived to India, but having authentic connection to India and having some, you didn't say anxiety, but I'm going to say anxiety of like representing an environment that you're not in. I definitely find comfort in speculative writing for that reason. I love creating my own worlds. Well, you don't know what my people do. I created them. They're my people. You can't tell me nothing. All right? You can't tell me nothing. But this book that's coming out in November, it's real kids in New York City. You know, one of them has anxiety issues. I had to do some research on what do they tell children about anxiety? How do they deal with anxiety issues? What are some of those things? But then I have my own relationship to, you know, anxiety and what it does to people and everything. I have an Indonesian character who, I don't have any Indonesian friends. So the publisher is having an Indonesian reviewer read that character, and we're having an anxiety expert read the anxiety character. I do have a character with a wheelchair, but he's not a main character. So I think I slid through on that. We'll see. But it does fill you with a little bit of anxiety, I think, to do it. I would rather get it wrong from a detail perspective than to be disrespectful or using a character for a violent purpose in my work, which is what happens when you see people as other. It happens a lot. We see that as, you know, anybody of color, when you see them walk on the screen, when you see these things happen, you know they're there to be eliminated, laughed at, to hold a bag, to be a best friend, to be the wise. You know, if it's a trope, then, you know, maybe don't make it another character. Maybe don't make it another culture other than your own, you know. Experiment with making that trope person be, you know, your culture, you know. So I think you definitely need to interrogate yourself, and you definitely need to be sure that you think of those people as human and that they have a human reason for being there, a reason that you can relate to from your heart as the writer.
And one other thing I wanted to mention is this character worked in my story already. And what I decided when I decided I wanted to write a wheelchair character, because I wanted something different, there was a fight scene. And so I went on YouTube and looked up fighting in a wheelchair. Guess what, folks? There's all kinds of stuff on there. So in my story, there is a fight and she wins. But, you know, I wouldn't know how to do that. So I just want to say the research worked to my advantage, because I already had the story and I just decided I want this character to be in it because I wanted to write a different kind of character.
Cool. Yeah, I also want to give props to writing that book too. I read it years ago, and it not being dramatic, but it really did change my life in terms of writing. It just, I don't know, it was very helpful. So as we're wrapping up, before I do some kind of closing remarks, one last question for each of you is, what are you reading now? And if you're not reading, what's the last book you read?
I struggle with reading because I have so much going on. I didn't always struggle with reading, but first, another writer said this on the panel, it's totally me. The advent of the cell phone with the games on it, horrible for my reading life. I used to come home and read, I would read into the night. And now I just have this little phone. Like, I can play games, I can build things, I can do people, you know what I mean? Like, I don't need to read. Obviously, I do need to read. You know what I'm saying? That's a falsehood. I'm turning away. That's one of the things Andaiye, I'm pronouncing your name differently. Andaiye, about being distracted. I'm all in the distractions and they feel good. So my reading is not great. But I was in a book club for a while, which I appreciate because I read for that. One of the books that we read was Billie Holiday's, it's called autobiography, but this man wrote it, but she told him the story, Lady Sings the Blues. And as writing, it's not that great, but as a story, as her history, it's really, really amazing. And I'll just say this because reading it made me realize something I didn't think about. She was talking about being on the road with a white van and how every time they needed to get a hotel, get a meal, it was a huge thing. She tried to tell them to leave her on the bus for meals and they didn't want to do that because it felt abusive to them. So they were like, no, 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 come in with us. Like, no, I don't want to do this. So they would go in, there would be a fight. They can't serve her. They throw them out. There's a fight. Then nobody's eating. It's a whole deal. It really degraded her health. And it made me think, I was like, wait a minute. You know, my parents went through this time period. So that means we're the first generation of Black people that did not have some form of segregation. Like, I'm a first generation non-segregated Black person. And I had never really thought about it that way. Like, that is a first that I think explains a lot about what's happening. So if I'm a first generation, you know, person, that means there's also kids of other cultures who might be first generation, you know, non-racist people. You know what I mean? They might be the first generation in their family not forwarding segregation, you know? So it's just an interesting thing from reading this nonfiction book. It totally shifted my perspective on, like, it didn't shift my perspective. I think I was talking about how obsessed we are with the first this and the first that. At the same time, we're also quick to be like, everything's changed, everything's great, everything's whatever, and totally ignore history. It's like we're obsessed with history and ignore it at the same time. It's a very bizarre thing we do, you know? So I think just sitting in that reality and being real about it, like, you know, this is where we are as a nation. This is the first generation. You know, I'm the first generation that had a childhood that was not segregated. I'm the first generation that had a childhood that I could go to school with anybody that I wanted. I had school choice, you know? And I think that means a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. It is jarring when you think of how recent history was. Linda's showing us a couple books.
Right. There's Otherwhere, Speculative Poetry by Akua Lisa Hope. Love. Afro Puffs are the antenna of the universe. Come on now. Literally, how? And Black Sun. I'm actually reading these all at the same time. It's crazy.
Oh.
And trying to write and being on panels. Black Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse. And then I was looking for the cover because it's beautiful, but I can't find it. But I'm reading Ring Shot, by P.D.
Jelly Clark.
Thank you, because I can always talk right. But it's amazing because he's back in the day when it wasn't like what you just said, Keaney, and the KKK and his monsters. Oh, it's so much fun.
Cool. I'm excited to put those on my list. Andea or Tenea?
I read a ton of books at the same time as you do, Linda, because I'm surrounded by them all day long. I had to look this up. I'm going to pronounce her name wrong, but I just finished Survival of the Thickest, which are some essays by comedian Michelle Buteau, B-E-E-A-U, who I think is hilarious, but she's from Jersey, so I had to read it. And I just started Hood Feminism by Nikki Kendall. And then I'm also doing an audiobook by David Sedaris. I think it's his latest one.
Cool.
I try not to read when I'm writing, but I've been very successful. So I'm trying to read short things. So I'm working on Blindness by Saramago, The Four Agreements, Ruiz, and New Sun's anthology. I'm almost done with it.
That's a great spread of books from everyone, like very different. So, okay, thank you four for coming. This was really, really great and informative and fun. I think everyone who came learned a lot, and anyone who couldn't come definitely will watch the recording, and I will probably be watching it again to ruminate on what everyone said. So yeah, we really appreciate your time coming here. And